go ahead and get started again. Recording is back on. Actually, one other thing I wanted to mention before we go through our solution, I did put in the file section a folder called Practice Midterms. There are 2 practice midterms and 2 practice midterm solutions in there if you want to prepare for next Wednesday's midterm exam. Okay? All right, so what we want to do, PowerPoint here, as I said, is go through our kind of Raytheon benchmarking. The first 2 companies were Raytheon against Lockheed Martin. I'd ask these 3 rows to kind of work on that one. So does anybody want to get started? Talk to me about Raytheon's ROiC tree. It's a quick walkthrough. Who wants to start from these 3 rows? Just quickly walking through about the first level for Raytheon. Yep.
So over the 5 years, the end-of-year ROiC decreased about 6%, or a percent change of negative 58%. The cash tax rate dropped, which should help them. However, the end-of-year pre-tax ROiC declined 68, almost 69%. This was primarily driven by the drop in operating margin, but there was an even bigger impact from a decrease in productivity.
Okay. I would say good from I think you're able to connect the dots. Challenge, use numbers. You stopped using numbers, particularly in the second part of the analysis. That will hurt you dramatically in your presentation next week, but generally had the right themes. So again, the pre-tax ROiC going from 14 to 4.5. The operating margin falling from 13.6 to 7.7 was really one of the big drivers, the pre-tax ROiC going down. But the productivity worsened from spending 95 cents per dollar in 2017 to $1.72 of invested capital per dollar sales in 2021. Okay, so Raytheon's performance over those 5 years is getting far worse. Right? What about Lockheed Martin? Somebody else go through the first level drivers for the 5 years, same 5 years for Lockheed Martin. Somebody else. How'd they do? Go ahead.
Their end-of-year ROiC was up from 2017, 10.2% to 28.8 in 2021. That's 182.5%. The pre-tax ROiC is up 21.7% from 28.3 in 2017 to 34.4 in 2021. That would increase the end-of-year ROiC. The cash tax rate also decreased, which would increase the end-of-year ROiC. The tax rate decreased from 64% in 2017 to 16.4 in 2021. So lower tax rate would be the higher ROiC. And you could also attribute the higher ROiC to a slight increase in operating margin from 13.5 cents in 2017 to 13.6 in 2021. It's like minimal, but you could still attribute some of it to it. And then you could also attribute it to a decrease in invested capital per sale, dropping from 48 cents in 2017 to like 40 cents in 2021, so it's down 17.2%, with the productivity increase, which would increase the ROiC.
So which of those 2 impacted it more? Was it the change in the margin or change in the productivity?
The productivity.
Yeah, Lockheed Martin's a productivity story. They got far more efficient over the 5 years with pretty much flat margins. Raytheon got worse in margins and worse in productivity. Okay, so back to, if you did your real world EIC on this, you would have realized 2 things. First, in that 5 years, Raytheon and United Technologies merged to become Raytheon Technology. Okay, so they became essentially a big conglomerate through a merger. Okay, second, as part of the merger, half their business is defense and aerospace, very comparable to Lockheed Martin. Half their business is commercial. Okay, so Raytheon, which is Pratt & Whitney engines, plus a bunch of commercial businesses. As a matter of fact, Raytheon makes their big chunk of the parts for the 737 MAX. So a lot of the components for the 737 MAX are Raytheon components in addition to the engines. So why might that matter to Raytheon's challenging performance over that 5 years? Yeah. Yeah, this is the Boeing jet that crashed a couple of times, got shut down worldwide, had a bunch of issues. So it didn't just affect Boeing, it affected their suppliers. And one of the biggest suppliers, the 737 MAX being Raytheon, they took a hit. Okay? Why else might commercial airlines struggle in this period? COVID. During COVID, the airlines weren't buying a bunch of planes. They put all their planes in the ground in Arizona, and they basically slowed down all their new orders because of COVID. That's going to hurt Raytheon far more than Lockheed Martin, which doesn't sell to commercial airlines. They're a government contractor. So the government part of Raytheon was actually doing okay, but the commercial part of Raytheon took a dive. And so when we look at the margins, that's where you actually see the split at the company and the reasons for that. Okay? But that being said, you can actually see why the defense and aerospace companies are going to consistently look better, not just Raytheon, but the other two companies we're about to hear for during that 5-year period. And that's the other thing you start to notice about Lockheed Martin and the other companies is the consistency of their margins, right? Because basically, if you're selling to the government these longer-term big contracts called programs, then if you sell a program, the government consistently pays you, and you sign a contract for a consistent margin over time. So these companies tend to be a little bit more predictable. That's not Raytheon, because now half their business got into commercial after that United Technology merger, and they're now getting boom and bust economic cycles, much more sensitive than a traditional defense and aerospace company. And you're seeing it play out even in the change in the ROiC trees over the 5 years. All right? As a matter of fact, if we were to look at what drove their margin down from 13.6% to 7.7% at Raytheon over the 5 years, why'd the operating margin go down? What about their second level drivers caused that to go down? Yeah.
Is it the depreciation expense?
Depreciation went up by almost, 3.5 cents per dollar? But they also saw a little bit of a drop in gross margin of about 3 cents per dollar. So there's the 6 cents right there. It was a combination of depreciation going up so much and gross margin going down. So depreciation is going to go up because you got more CapEx that you're spreading out over time, right? So either they're doing massive investments in capital expenditures, we're not seeing that in PP&E, or sales drop. And if you have less sales in the same equipment, depreciation goes up. So that goes back to the commercial part of their business took a hit, and that's probably one of the reasons why their depreciation as a percentage of sales was worse, right? And ultimately, they were getting less on their sales as well from a lower gross margin. They did cut their SG&A by about a point. Right? Now, Lockheed Martin improved its productivity over time. Why? Why did they go from 48 cents to 40 cents in invested capital sales over that 5 years? What did they improve? Yeah.
Their intangibles dropped 9 cents.
So they got a lot more efficiency out of their acquisitions. So like I said, the amount of acquisition spending is like a fixed cost, right? And so the question is, if I have more sales to the same fixed cost, then my cost per unit goes down. So when you see intangibles go down, it's either because they're writing off a lot of intangibles or they're selling more sales relative to those intangibles. All right, that's another way to measure an acquisition's productivity. Because basically if I spend a lot of money on an acquisition, then I want to see a corresponding increase in sales to justify that it's paying off. One of those two things occurred for Lockheed Martin, but that was what was driving their productivity higher and their ROiCs higher. Okay? Now, how did Raytheon stack up against Northrop Grumman? So this team had already talked about Northrop Grumman. So these three rows, Raytheon, somebody give me the highlights of the first level for Northrop Grumman in these three rows. First level Northrop Grumman. Walk me through it. Yeah.
Yeah, so their end of year ROiC was initially a little compressed from 14 to 12%, but it jumped in 2021 to 16%. And I mean, a large driver of that was actually the cash tax rate decreasing from 32% to 21%. And then Their end of year like pre-tax ROIC slightly was compressed. It dropped about almost 2% over the 5-year period, but like they're still a lot better off than Raytheon Technologies, obviously, who's almost dropped like 70%. And then a main driver of that compression was their decrease in productivity, so their invested capital to sales, and definitely not their operating margin, because that actually increased 28% over this 5-year period. And I could hop to the third level too to explain that.
All right. Before you do, I will say what I like that you started out with is you also gave a nod to the intervening years and the trends there, so that was nice. But here's what I would just change about your wording. The pre-tax ROIC from 20.7 to 20.4, I mean, that went down slightly, but virtually unchanged. Okay, so their pre-tax margin stayed about the same over the 5 years at Northrop Grumman. But notice the business didn't, meaning, as he just said, the operating margin got a lot better. They went from a 12.4% operating margin to a 15.8% operating margin. So they're making a lot more when they sell their products. But why didn't the pre-tax change? Because they spent a heck of a lot more money to do it. Okay, so they made big investments in their balance sheet and invested capital sales, going from 59.7 to 77.7. Okay, so in a way, those two offset each other. So I'm making more on what I sell, but I'm spending a whole lot more reinvestment to sell it. So essentially, think about it as almost like a free cash flow basis. I generate a lot of gross cash flow, but I put it all back in gross investment. So I'm kind of neutral on my overall level of performance. That's kind of the story of what you saw with Northrop Grumman. So even though their margins stayed about, their ROIC stayed about the same over time, they had a difference in the way they were making it. More spent on higher margin products. Okay, where Raytheon was actually spending a lot more for lower margin products. Big difference between the two. Okay? In the interest of time, let's do General Dynamics against Raytheon. Somebody do the first level for General Dynamics over there. Those two rows. Yeah.
Yeah, so if we look at General Dynamics, their end-of-year ROIC decreased from 15.9% to 9.9% in 2021. We look at their end-of-year pre-tax ROIC, that decreased significantly as well from 22.3% to 11.8%, which is negative obviously, but positive. The cash tax rate decreased from 28.6% to 15.9%. So when looking at the drivers for maybe why the cash tax rate decreased, you can see that they became less productive over time. Their invested capital over sales increased from 61.3 cents to 91.7%. Cents. If you look at why they became less productive over time, you can see that their operating working capital increased pretty significantly from 9.3 cents to 16.9 cents in 2021. And then when looking at the drivers of why their operating margin got worse from 13.7 cents to 10.8 cents, you can see that their gross margin decreased significantly from 21.6 cents to 19 cents, but even more significant than that was the increase in depreciation from 1.4 cents to 2.3 cents.
Okay, so they got lower gross margin, higher depreciation, and that dropped their operating margin. Okay. So, again, I know we're kind of running out of time here, but one other thing, if you look across all four companies, you'll notice that the best performing of all four was Lockheed Martin. They had the highest ROIC, almost 29% by 2021, much higher than everyone else in the industry. And if you try to understand, like, why is Lockheed Martin doing so much better, and I know Raytheon was the analysis, but you kind of see the four companies. One of the trends you'll notice is Lockheed Martin had the best invested capital to sales ratio of all of the companies, right? So Raytheon's invested capital to sales was $1.72. Lockheed's 40 cents. Northrop Grumman spends almost 80 cents, 78 cents per dollar. General Dynamics spends 92 cents per dollar, all 2021 dollars. Lockheed Martin spends 38. So Lockheed Martin is actually the class of the defense and aerospace industry in terms of performance when they look to investors. And you can actually see right here why. It's not because their margins are better, it's because they're so much more efficient at running their business using less capital to generate sales than all of their peers. That's been their secret sauce over time. You can kind of see that with the benchmarking. So why I wanted to do this, number one, give you some additional practice going into next week's group presentation. Number two, throw some real world context onto some of these issues so you start to understand that. What I talked to you about Raytheon at the beginning as well, some of those insights you might be talking about Dentsu, all right? And number three, I told you when we started this historical section that when we put statements into a format, which I know you were going to find a pain to convert, there'd be a benefit. And here we start to see some of the benefit. Like it becomes a very straightforward to analyze a company, and more importantly, it becomes a very straightforward way to even benchmark companies across each other to start gathering some insights. All right, so ROiC tree, CFI. All right, so here's what we're going to do. On Wednesday, I don't have any more content for you. So what I'm going to do is we're not going to have a lecture, and I'm just going to give your teams time to work on your Dentsu presentation. Okay? So there will be no live lecture on Wednesday. There's just work on Dentsu, finish up your Bloomberg Trading Challenge if you need to make some additional trades. So I'd strongly recommend working with your teams. Use this time to do that on Wednesday so that you're fully prepared to come in next Monday and do a good job with Dentsu. Okay? CFI, ROiC tree. All right, TAs have office hours at the end of this week. Hopefully the grades for these assignments will be in later this week, so you'll get some feedback on that. But again, we've recorded the videos for this, which will be posted a little bit later today. Yes, sir. What I'm going to do with homework 7 is I'm going to actually postpone homework 7, just because I want to make sure that next week is just focused on getting ready for the midterm exam. So that's the other thing. Take the practice midterms this week. Practice the midterms. Practice your group projects. I'm going to postpone homework 7 a week, so that way you have time to work on those too. I'll see you 1 week from today for presentations. Have a great week, everybody.